For most of his life, Mel Brooks has handled pain the same way he handles everything else. With laughter, it's how got through loss, heartbreak, and the quiet erosion of time. But at 99 years old, something finally slipped past that armor. When Brooks recently spoke about the death of Rob Reiner, his words didn't come with jokes or theatrics. Music, they came softly and they hit hard. What they shared wasn't dramatic, but it was crushing. And once you understand the history between them, the long silence he kept suddenly makes perfect sense. The dark, music roots of Mel Brooks' humor. Mel Brooks would eventually become one of the great giants of American comedy. But nothing about his beginning hinted at comfort or privilege. He wasn't born into glamour or security. He was born on a kitchen table in a crumbling Brooklyn tenement. It's a detail that feels oddly fitting, like the opening gag of a lifelong music story built on improvisation and survival. That moment may have been the brightest spot of his earliest years. Tragedy arrived quickly and without mercy. When Mel was just 2 years old, his father died from kidney tuberculosis, leaving the family struggling to survive in deep poverty. The loss carved something permanent into him. Even as an older man, Brooks carried a quiet fury about it, a sense that the universe had made an unforgivable move far too early. If there was warmth in that household, it came from his mother. She poured affection into her youngest son with almost theatrical intensity. On cold Brooklyn mornings, she dressed him while singing old romantic standards, turning routine moments into little performances. Music, Mel absorbed it all. One day, still barely 5, he sang one of those songs at school. A teacher heard him, and before he knew it, he was standing in front of the entire school performing. That was the moment something clicked. The noise, the attention, the reaction of the crowd. It all felt right. Even at that age, he understood the strange power of standing in front of people and making them feel something, especially laughter. At home, comedy was already unfolding daily. His mother, fiercely protective of tradition, would enlist him as a lookout whenever his grandmother visited. The instant Mel signaled her arrival, the kitchen exploded into motion. Non-kosher food vanished at lightning speed. Evidence erased just seconds before the door opened. Then calm returned, music, as if nothing had happened. That frantic choreography, the timing, the absurdity, it was pure slapstick. Years later, it would feel indistinguishable from a scene in one of his films. Life, however, music, wasn't funny most of the time. Growing up poor and without a father hardened him early. Brooks later admitted that much of his comedy was driven by anger and hostility. Emotions forged in those formative years. On the streets of Brooklyn, humor wasn't just entertainment. It was armor. Mel was small, sickly, and visibly different. Music, which made him an easy target. Bullies didn't need much encouragement, and being Jewish only added to the cruelty. His quick wit often saved him. A sharp joke could diffuse a situation just enough to avoid real damage. In his own telling, comedy quite literally kept him from getting hit. That instinct for mischief showed up early too, sometimes crossing the line. Long before fame, he once lifted a pack of gum and a toy water gun from a drugstore. When the clerk confronted him, Mel raised the toy as if it were real. The bluff worked. The clerk froze and Mel walked out chewing his stolen prize. It's a story he later told with amusement, but it also reveals something deeper. Even as a kid, Mel Brooks understood performance, timing, and the power of illusion. Hal learned early that if you could control the moment, if you could make people react, you could survive almost anything. How chaos shaped Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks grew up to the constant whir of sewing machines, the soundtrack of a household built on garment work and survival. For a long time, it seemed obvious where his life was headed, cutting fabric, stitching seams, and following a practical path laid out in front of him. But even then, something else was quietly pulling at him. Years later, Brooks would describe the exact moment that pull became impossible. Toinure. Sitting in the very last row of a Broadway performance of Anything Goes so far back he could barely see the stage, he felt it, music, anyway. From the cheapest seats in the house, he suddenly understood what he wanted. Show business wasn't just entertainment. It was where he belonged. He started young. By 14, Brooks was already working parties as an entertainer, learning the hard way that getting laughs, music, sometimes came with real risks. One of his early routines became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Dressed in a sharp business suit, derby hat, and a heavy alpaca coat, he'd sprint out holding a briefcase stuffed with rocks, shout that business was terrible, and then launch himself straight into a swimming pool. The crowd loved it. The problem was that he couldn't swim back up. The soaked coat and rock-filled briefcase dragged him under every single time, forcing a lifeguard, music, to rescue him before the bit turned fatal. Somehow the danger only made the act more popular. That notoriety, music, landed him a stage role playing a 75-year-old man, an absurd casting choice that somehow made sense in Brooks' world. Even there, chaos followed him. During one performance he dropped, music, a glass scarf mid-scene. It shattered, flooding the stage. Instead of freezing, Brooks' music broke character completely. He ripped off his wig, stepped forward into the footlights, and owned the moment. The audience erupted and didn't stop laughing for nearly an hour. That instinct to tear down the wall between performer and audience would become a defining feature of his comedy. Behind the silliness was a razor-sharp mind. Brooks tested at a genius level and the Army took notice. After high school, he entered the Army Specialized Training Program where he studied electrical engineering alongside oddly theatrical skills like horseback riding and saber fighting. It was an unusual prelude to a very real war. Music. By 1944, Brooks was in uniform as a combat engineer with the 114th Engineer Combat Battalion. Whether drafted or enlisted by choice, he found himself in Europe during one of the war's most brutal chapters. His unit was involved in the Battle of the Bulge, where chaos, confusion, and heavy casualties defined daily life. Accounts differ on how close he was to the front lines, but music. Brooks always insisted he was dropped straight into the madness. Sirens, tanks, and sudden gunfire became his new reality. When not under fire, his work involved building bridges, clearing roads, music, and dismantling enemy defenses, dangerous tasks that left little room for mistakes. The job terrified him. Halliday joked that combat engineering combined the two music things he disliked most, combat and engineering. Yet the danger was real, especially when defusing landmines. Oddly enough, Brooks worried just as much about his hearing as his life. The noise was relentless. To cope, he stuffed cigarette butts into his ears, a crude solution that left him half deaf, half dazed, and strangely, music, insulated from the world. Germany left a permanent mark on him. He never forgot the sight of bodies wrapped in mattress covers lining the roads, a grim reminder of how close death always was. To stay sane, he sang music, constantly, and leaned into humor, using laughter as a shield against fear. After the war, Brooks stayed in Europe performing for troops, keeping spirits, music, up even as old prejudices lingered. When a heckler crossed a line with anti-Semitic abuse, Brooks' music didn't argue. He calmly removed his helmet, explained he didn't want to damage Army property, and then dropped the man with his metal mess kit. The result was time in the stockade, music, and a clear message. Despite everything, Brooks left the Army with an honorable discharge. Back in New York, he finally let himself chase the dream that had been waiting all along. He started as a musician in Catskills nightclubs, music, playing drums and piano, even learning from jazz legend Buddy Rich. But the spotlight kept calling. Music. One night, when a comedian didn't show up, Brooks was pushed on stage with no act and no plan. He improvised, trusted his instincts, and won the room. From that moment on, he leaned fully into comedy, blending impressions, spontaneity, and raw energy. Not everyone approved. After one performance, a well-meaning older woman gently suggested he consider a stable career in aviation mechanics. It was practical advice, but Brooks had already chosen something else. And as history would prove, music, turned out to be a very good living. How everything almost collapsed. As a teenager, Mel Brooks pulled off something almost unthinkable. He befriended music, said Caesar. And once Brooks returned to New York, he made sure that connection paid off. He followed Caesar everywhere, pitching jokes relentlessly, slipping in one-liners between meetings, never letting up. Eventually, Caesar gave in. Music. At just 24, Brooks was offered a chance to write for a new television project. For Brooks, it felt like a dream and a nightmare rolled into one. The show was your show of shows, a runaway success that would later be considered legendary. On screen it was brilliant. Off screen it was a pressure cooker. By Brooks' own account, everyone despised everyone else. The writer's room wasn't a creative retreat. It was a battlefield. Every writer was fighting to get a single joke on air, and the competition was brutal. That room was stacked with future icons. Mel Tolkien, Lucille Callan, music Joe Stein, Larry Galbart, Mike Stewart, and even a young Woody Allen. All of them were sharpening their knives in the same space, trying to outdo one another. As intense as that environment was, Brooks faced an even bigger problem. Officially, he wasn't supposed to be there at all. The show's producer, Max Lehman, music, despised him. To get around that, Sid Caesar quietly paid Brooks $50 a week under the table. Lehman's hatred wasn't subtle either. He was known to fling lit cigars straight at Brooks' face. To be fair, Brooks had earned his reputation. He was already infamous for his pranks, and Lehman became his favorite target. On 80, Brooks decided to impersonate baseball star Pepper Martin. He sprinted down the hallway toward Lehman at full speed, shouting that Pepper Martin was sliding into second base. At the last second, Brooks dove, music, head first between Lehman's legs. The producer was so startled that he jumped into the air and slammed into the ceiling. After music, the cigar attacks made a little more sense. Still, even Lehman called deny Brooks' talent. Eventually, Sid Caesar officially brought him onto the payroll. Suddenly, Brooks was earning an astonishing $5,000 a week. The success carried over into Caesar's hour. And for a while it looked like Brooks had made it for good. Then it all disappeared. The work dried up. The money vanished. Brooks went from television royalty to freelancing $4.85 a week. The timing couldn't have been worse. In the early 1950s, he had fallen in love with Florence Baum, an actress and dancer appearing in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. They married, and while Brooks had once been flush with cash, even his peak earnings hadn't prepared him for the reality of marriage and financial instability. Years later, Brooks would joke that there were no savings to fall back in. He was married and buried in debt, stunned by how fast it all unraveled. Despite being broke and unhappy at home, Brooks remained magnetic in social settings. At parties he was unstoppable. Around this time he and fellow writer Rob Reiner began fooling around with an improvised bit. Brooks played a man who had been alive for 2,000 years. The two had been close ever in music, since meeting in 1950 while working for Sid Caesar, and they naturally fed off each other's energy. The routine started as an inside joke. Carl had once pitched a sketch inspired by a news show that dramatized real events, but it was rejected. During a break one day, he casually revived the idea as a joke, announcing a man who had witnessed the crucifixion firsthand. Brooks instantly jumped in, responding in a thick Yiddish accent. It was nonsense, pure and simple, meant only to fill a few minutes. They never intended it for a wider audience. It was just something to amuse friends at gatherings, but when they performed it at a party it caught the attention of George Burns.